Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Strategic Co-Investor Approach, Lessons from the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Family-Centered Community Change Initiative. I am your host, Alexandra West. I'm going to run through a couple quick housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kintaini Murray, who's going to kick us off. But real quick, just as you see here on the screen, we will use the Q&A function on the bottom right of your screen to communicate with one another throughout today's event. We encourage you to submit questions at any time, and we've reserved time at the end of the presentation to address them. If you experience technical difficulties, you see both a link and a phone number here that you can use to address them. And I do want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded. We will make the link available on the Casey Foundation website, www.aecf.org, later this month. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kintaini Murray.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing you to today's speakers. First, we have Lakeisha Bragg, Systems Director for Dual Generation, United Way of San Antonio and Bexar County. Dr. Henrietta Munoz, Executive Director of the Institute for School and Community Partnership for Texas A&M University, San Antonio. Jared Rayner, Director of Evaluation with the TCC Group. And again, I am Kintaini Murray, Senior Research Associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I've had the privilege of managing the FCCC, or what we call Family-Centered Community Change Evaluation. We can go to the next slide. Our agenda for today's webinar first includes background on the Family-Centered Community Change, or FCCC context, and then a description of the Strategic Co-Investor Evaluation and the Strategic Co-Investor Evaluation approach, followed by a community conversation led by Lakeisha and Henry, highlighting the San Antonio dual generation partnership perspectives on the partnership's experience with the Strategic Co-Investor approach. We'll conclude with questions and answers, next steps, and then our closing. FCCC was designed to support local partnerships as they developed a more integrated set of services, including housing assistance, high-quality education, and job training, to name a few, to help parents and their children succeed together in what is known as a two-generation approach. Casey awarded grants to neighborhood-based partnerships in Buffalo, New York, Columbus, Ohio, and San Antonio, Texas. Each partnership had a comprehensive community change initiative already underway, as well as a history of cross-organizational collaboration and a commitment to resident engagement. We can go to the next slide. So rather than creating something new, the foundation sought to be a strategic co-investor in joining the existing local partnerships. This represented a unique mindset and a departure from more directive approaches. Casey provided technical assistance, training, and peer learning opportunities to build on the existing partnerships' community change efforts. To examine the implementation of the strategic co-investor approach, the Foundation commissioned a third-party evaluation led by the TCC Group. Through this work, the TCC Group has documented lessons for adapting the approach in the future. We can move to the next slide. And now Jared Rayner of the TCC Group will share more about the FCCC Strategic Co-Investor Evaluation.
Thank you, Kintaini, and good afternoon or good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us for the webinar today. My name is Jared Rayner, and I'm the Director of Evaluation and Learning at TCC Group. And over the last 7 years, we accompanied all the partners of the family-centered community change, or as Kentayani said, FCCC, on an evaluation and learning journey related to a new adapted approach to place-based investing. As Kentayani mentioned, Casey called this approach a strategic co-investor approach. One of our first activities in our role as evaluator was to get clear what was the model and how did it differ conceptually from other place-based grant-making approaches. In essence, did Casey just make something up, or was there actually something real here in terms of a different model? We did benchmarking of other place-based initiatives and created a typology of activities and approaches. Next slide, please. Through that benchmarking, we arrived at 8 core components of the strategic co-investor approach. Number 1, flexible grant funding that placed the community in the driver's seat of the effort. Number 2, a high-touch staffing model that included 1 program officer at Casey for 3 large grants, where the program officer spent considerable time in each community. 3, a non-directive relationship where there was an agreed upon conceptual framework, but local flexibility in designing the how and what of the program. 4, Casey funding would provide a glue for a broader partnership of funders and implementers to contribute money and other resources. In all 3 locations of FCCC, there was a core relationship with at least 1 other funder as part of the core work. Number 5, the funder would be there as a thought partner and was expected to contribute in that way in addition to funding. They would also provide technical assistance, but that assistance would be grounded in requests from the community, a bottom-up or demand-driven approach to technical assistance. Number 6, there would be networking across all the sites at all levels, not just at the senior level. This included parents, frontline workers, and others working in various places of the initiative, including data and evaluation. Number 7, the specific program work, in this case, two-generation approach, would be nested within a broader community change effort. For FCCC, this included 2 federal promise neighborhood initiatives and a 3rd targeted multi-funder neighborhood initiative. And finally, number 8, the project would be evaluated at both the program side, but also on the process side. The funder, Casey, was not exempt from being evaluated. In this case, the Urban Institute conducted the two-generation evaluation, while TCC Group evaluated the process of the strategic co-investor approach. Individually, some of these might feel more or less novel on their own, but collectively, they were designed to elicit a different experience for both the funder and the partner grantees. Next slide, please. Once we had better clarity on the model, we designed a responsive evaluation approach that would prioritize how the community partners were experiencing the strategic co-investor approach. The evaluation consisted of yearly surveys and site visits that included core FCCC partners, as well as partners that were operating more adjacent to the two-generation work within the broader community change initiative. We also monitored the types of requests that were being made of partners and participated in ongoing events and convenings. The evaluation was largely what we would call a developmental / formative hybrid, and so we were providing consistent feedback over the course of the initiative. All of our findings included 3 sets of recommendations. 1 set of recommendations directed at Casey, 1 set of recommendations directed at community partners, and a 3rd set of recommendations that needed to be shared jointly between the 2 groups. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? Well, a high-level summary of findings can be found in an infographic we developed that is on the Casey Foundation's website at the link that you can see here in the slides, which will be available to you after the webinar. The findings include a need for both the funder and community partner to change their mindset about the relationship. The importance of naming quote unquote non-negotiables, those things that were critically important to all partners, and a finding that the strategic co-investor approach by itself doesn't eliminate funder-grantee power dynamics. We are just finalizing a final report that will be released to the public, and we will include all of you in our initial distribution of the report. But the exciting thing today is that we get to hear firsthand about some of these findings from two people that experienced the co-investor approach firsthand. Next slide, please. Because of limited time, we collectively selected 3 of the 8 areas to dig into today. These include a non-directive relationship, the nesting approach, and the evaluation. I am so pleased to be joined by 2 members of the San Antonio Dual Generation Partnership, Lakeisha Bragg and Dr. Henrietta Munoz. Lakeisha, Henry, welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lakeisha, I want to start by asking you to maybe introduce yourself a little bit and your role with the FCCC initiative, and also maybe share a little bit about, for you, was there anything different or unique about the strategic co-investor approach?
Thank you, Jared. Good afternoon, everyone. As stated, my name is Lakeisha Bragg, and I'm the Systems Director of the Dual Generation Initiative for United Way here in San Antonio. I have been in my current position for 6 months, and I'm actually replacing Henry, who you'll meet in a moment. My role is to now oversee the collective in partnership as the backbone organization. But prior to this role, I was a program manager for 10.5 years with our partnered agency, Goodwill Industries. I managed the initiative from the partner level for 7 years and worked frontline with families. I coached families through their career pathways and employment, and I placed children in early childhood services. What I would say I found unique about Casey, I would think it would, and we're also going to cover it later in the webinar, but I would think it's really about the strategic partner and not what seemed to be, how they seem not to be like a traditional funder. And we'll go into more detail, but they did not come in deciding or demanding how we would do our efforts within our community. They seem to be more supportive than your traditional funder. So I would say that's what I found to be real unique about the strategic co-investor.
That's great. Lakeisha, thank you so much. Henry, I wonder if you could share a little bit about yourself and your role, as well as you have a long history with the Casey Foundation. Was this different than anything else that they'd done before?
Thank you, Jared. I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation. Still as a member of the Dual Generation Initiative, and into the future, hopefully. I'm Henry Munoz, and today I work with A&M University here in San Antonio, and I am the executive director for the A&M San Antonio Institute for School and Community Partnerships, which carries a lot of the 2-generation model and work that we started, Lakeisha and I, and a whole host of partners back on the east side of San Antonio. I was the person that helped led the initiative for the Backbone organization. The Backbone organization, in this instance, in the Dual Generation Initiative, is the United Way here in San Antonio and Bexar County. And I worked for the United Way for 11 years, and I was very privileged to be able to help lead this initiative along with our partners like Goodwill Industries, of which Lakeisha was part of. And Lakeisha happened to be part of this initiative since the inception, during our pilot phase. So we've been together for quite some time. And I would say just one bit of notation, my perspective, my lens that I bring to this conversation, Jared, also includes my longer history with the Annie Casey Foundation, in that I worked very closely and helped lead the Making Connections effort, which is another community transformation effort and initiative that the Annie Casey Foundation had. And I was at the tail end of that initiative, so the last 4 years of that initiative, also here in San Antonio on an opposite side of town, on the west side of town. So I have some perspective there, as well as being an Annie E. Casey Children and Family Fellow. So lots of Casey interaction between myself and the foundation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Henry, so much. Appreciate that background. I want to move us, now that folks know a little bit about who we are, to maybe the first area that we agreed upon. So next slide, please. So we decided that we would focus on, first of all, this non-directive relationship. And I just want to remind everyone who's listening to the webinar that we really welcome your questions and comments, would invite you to put those into the chat function. We will be monitoring that over the course of the webinar. So please feel free to capture those thoughts before you lose them, because we're gonna cover some really interesting ideas. Henry, starting with this non-directive relationship, I mean, you talked about making connections and your role, deep roots in the community. Lots of funders want to position themselves as a partner working with the community. I'm curious, in the context of the strategic co-investor approach of FCCC, what did Casey do to be a partner, and were there any shortcomings?
So I would say that the short answer here is, what did they do? So let me address that piece of the question, Jared. What did they do? They were here on the ground. And the Annie E. Casey Foundation is a national foundation, as everyone here probably knows. And to fly from the headquarters of that foundation in Baltimore, Maryland, to San Antonio is not an easy flight. In fact, a few years there were no direct flights, and so you had to spend practically a day to get here, or the evening flying, in order to be here in time for a meeting the next morning and spend some time in the site. And so the first thing that we noticed that was different than some of the other experiences that we have with national funders, at the very least, but also some local funders, is that there was a physical presence here on the ground in San Antonio. And that presence also, it was actual person, that person was also part of our governance team. And so we had a collaborative table with close to 10 to 15 partners that would come together. And the person from the Annie E. Casey Foundation would actually join us at that table to stand up the pilot initially, and then to move forward with our development and design. So that was, I would say, probably the most prominent distinction of a funder, and that goes directly to this development of relationship. Was it always that way? Over time, we demanded more time, because we found a huge value added for that foundation to be at our table. And so try to negotiate additional time, try to negotiate additional folks from the foundation to visit with us and be our thought partner. And so I would say it ebbed and flowed, but for the vast majority of our partnership, we had representation from the Casey Foundation from Baltimore here in San Antonio. And that is actually pretty amazing to think about that level of investment.
That's great, Henry. Thank you so much. Lakeisha, I'm curious, from your perspective, you hadn't had any experience with the Casey Foundation really before, so you didn't have sort of that comparator. But when you saw them showing up, were you surprised? Did this feel different? And was there anything different about what Casey did to be a partner from your perspective? You were on the front lines at the time.
Right, exactly. It was different. Again, when you think about traditional funders, you think something totally different and you see something totally different. So from what I witnessed, I'm seeing Casey making themselves available. Here you are, you have a funder that's showing up to not only our partner meetings, but they're coming to our family engagement events. They're meeting our families, they're talking to our families, and then also having these yearly community learning convenings so we can learn with other communities that made up the FCCC. I think just the overall process and the approach was different. And, looking at it now, it's like really, really appreciated.
Great. Lakeisha, I wonder if you might continue and talk about, we often, when we talk about partnership with grantees, we want to hear like, what does the funder need to do to be a better partner, right? And so we sort of turn the lens that way. I want to flip that lens for a minute and ask you, what did you need to do differently on the ground in this relationship?
So I would say, thinking back to my previous role within a community-based organization with Goodwill and being on the frontline staff, and now being part of a backbone organization, I see how the mindsets must shift and the trust needs to be built early on. So as a workforce development partner, I wasn't deeply rooted in the funding conversations. My organization had like a specific role, and we were aware of what we brought to the partnership, which is why when I add the importance of having a strong backbone organization to oversee any collective impact model. So we had a strong leader where we didn't have to have that experience working too closely on the fundamentals with the foundation. So if we ever needed something, I would go to Henry and Henry would be our voice. That was until she basically said, Casey's going to come down here to our meetings. When the foundation comes, we're going to address these issues as a partnership. I think she wanted us to express our concerns and state our requests directly to Casey. I think that is when I knew the approach of the foundation could be different. It was different. And she was setting the tone for us to build that relationship with Casey and view it, and it viewed and turned out to be much different.
Lakeisha, I love that answer. You said two things that really stood out to me about that you needed to understand what you brought to the partnership. And I think that that's just such a critical point that we found in the evaluation, that partners that understood where they fit in were better able to fit into the model. The second thing was you talked about that the backbone organization wanted you to go directly to Casey. And I think that in the evaluation findings, we identified early on that there was a tension point about the backbone being a gatekeeper. And if there's a gatekeeper, how does that lend itself to a true co-investor partnership? And so I love that you raising this issue that the backbone encouraged you to go directly to Casey. That took some work, right? Like that took some guts on both your part and on Casey's part to open it up for that relationship. Thanks so much for lifting that up. Henry, the other thing that Lakeisha mentioned was that they had sort of super person of the world as the leader of their backbone organization in terms of Dr. Henrietta Munoz. There's no understating the important role that you played in leading that effort. I'm curious from your perspective, how did your behavior need to change in the strategic co-investor approach model?
Thank you, Jared, for that question. I think Lakeisha actually hit it, right? So I think two really important points here. One, the backbone organization itself, the United Way, needed to be open for all kinds of power shifting and power sharing. So I think that that's number one. I felt incredibly supported by the organization, knowing that the Annie Casey Foundation was moving into a role called co-investor and the opportunities that could mean in the future. And as we learn through this design, so the organization, I'd like to lift up the United Way and potentially the other organizations that are a part of, or were part of this work, the FCCC work, because it did mean for the backbone organization to be open to shifting that power. And you have to have that level of support, right, from your board of directors or board of trustees in order for that shift of power to happen. And so I think that that's one thing that I'd like to lift up. And another thing is that number one, this was not a sole source type of work by one person. This included not only the backbone organization as a whole, from director all the way down to myself, but also included the desire by all of us to be a collaborative set of partners on equal footing. And although there have been some years that not everybody felt that, there have been some years that not everybody understood where their contributions were. But I would say over the set collectively of 7 years to 8 years on how this initiative developed in San Antonio, specifically with Annie EKC, that holistically during those years, what was designed was this ability to share this power and ability to be vulnerable on all sides. So the vulnerability and the openness that you need to have in this type of relationship, I think is really critical. And that doesn't, I was about to say that doesn't actually cost anything. Like there's no financial cost to it, but there's a cost from everyone that is a part of it, right? Because you have to be open, you have to be vulnerable, you have to want to build that level of trust with the funder, the quote unquote funder, in this case, co-investor, right? As well as the partners need to do that with backbone organizations and everybody at play.
I love that sharing power and vulnerability, Henry, that you lift up. We had a question from the audience about what did Casey have to give up to be a truly supportive partner? And I think that part of it, is answered in that part of the question, right? They had to give up some of their power. They had to give up, they had to make themselves vulnerable. So give up some level of certainty. I wonder if either of you would add anything to, from your perspective, what did Casey have to give up to be a truly supportive partner?
I would say they had to give up a lot of time, because at one point we requested a lot of time. So, and we know that it could be time consuming, and we were really needy at some points. So me personally, I would say time. I think I didn't see any power dynamics or any power shifts, so I can't really speak too much of that, but I know that they did invest a lot of time with us.
Thanks, Lakeisha. Henry, anything that you would add?
I think Lakeisha again hit it the head on the nail here, the nail on the head here, and that is the time. The one thing that I would add, Jared, is that it likely, so when a grantor invests a grant or allows for an award to go out, there's a certain amount of funds for that award. If you think about the time that Lakeisha just mentioned that is required of the person traveling from one state to another, that award is no longer that finite number. It grows, right? So when we think about time, just think about how much more money the foundation needed to invest to create this co-investor role and to make it happen, right? And so I think time is critical here to think about, as well as the additional investment of having somebody every month come to San Antonio, and in some cases be in San Antonio more frequent than every month, right? So as Lakeisha noted, that we had a few times where we asked for the foundation to be present more than just once a month. So just to keep that in mind.
That's great. Listening to the two of you, one might walk away from this webinar and think, oh, it was such a lovely relationship. It was just so nice from the beginning. I think that, as the evaluator, I had the chance to speak with both of you over multiple years, and I know that there were there were some tension points. It wasn't always roses, right? I'm curious if Henry, if there are any tension points that you might that you recall in the relationship that you might highlight in terms of navigating this non-directive relationship where maybe Casey didn't quite show up the way that you were hoping they would.
Yeah, there are a few of them, and now that we're on the other side of this, right? The perspective in general, I'd like to say, is this rosy colored perspective that I have on our relationship. But there were tension points. Tension points included demands on data, and I know that some of the components, Jared, that you mentioned, data is one of those. Now, we were huge supporters of the data collection, but not without tension. There was tension there on how do we become collaborators of and tell our own story, our own narrative on what's happening in our communities. How do we work with evaluators on that? Because we understood the co-investor role, even though it was explained multiple times over years, it still meant something maybe slightly different, right, in interpretation to our site locally than it does to the national folks. So when we think about evaluation and data collection and research that was needed, we wanted to be part of that and part of that conversation. And although I think this is something that the Casey Foundation was open to, there was some tension on, well, can that even happen? Can a site be a collaborative in telling their own story when we're fitting the bill, and we, right, the foundation is fitting the bill for this level of evaluation. So I think that that's an interesting point to settle on. Another thing, just as something that I always remember, and that is we in this request for additional time, we found out that because the other two sites are closer to Baltimore, there was more time spent in the other two sites. And so we had a meeting, a conversation with our representative from the foundation, who has become a dear colleague of ours. And we said, hey, we need that same level of response. And so there was, again, quite a little bit of tension just on our end, needing some more hands-on work in our site, and only getting that once a month was, we felt, not enough. And if I were to be very candid, we felt somewhat unfair that the other sites were getting that level of interaction and we were not. So quickly everything got remedied, but those were a few places where there was some tension.
Love that. I remember, Henry, and I think that we've talked about this before, so I think I can say this without breaking any confidence, that there was a couple of those moments where you had to have those sort of heart-to-hearts with your program officer and the courage and sort of say, hey, look, this isn't going the way we wanted to. And I think there's something about that courage that's a really important point to lift up about sort of the behavior that isn't always comfortable for grantees in a relationship. So I really appreciate you lifting that up. Lakeisha, I want to give you just a chance to also answer that tension point. And one of the things that you said earlier that really struck me is on the front lines, you didn't really feel some of those tensions, and I think that's an important lesson in and of itself. And I wonder if you might speak a little bit about how you experienced Casey directly, and you know, what did that mean to you to have that access?
I think I can speak to some tension points. But I think my biggest tension point was the reporting and evaluation, which I'm sure we'll get to.
We'll talk about, yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But I think that without going into that section yet, I would say that it was definitely the evaluations and the reporting piece. Especially being a frontline staff and on the ground and being responsible for working with families, that alone requires a lot of time and attention. So gradually, constantly being pulled away from those types of activities to focus on reporting and evaluations created a strain and tension points for me. I think that's probably the most Henry probably would hear from me is when it was around that time, for that reason.
I think we're going to have a lot of time to talk about that. So I'm going to move us on to the next part of the conversation because I do think that we'll get to the evaluation component and some interesting things there. But our next area that we wanted to talk about was this notion of nesting of a focused issue within an existing broader community change effort. Henry, let me ask you maybe to briefly describe. I mentioned in my introductory remarks that the Promise neighborhood sort of served as a core nesting area for the dual generation initiative. Would you talk a little bit about what gap or opportunity did you expect to fill within this, this broader comprehensive change, community change initiative?
Absolutely, Jared. Thank you again for the question here. I think it's a unique, definitely a unique design with this nesting piece. In San Antonio, we had just won, the United Way, in fact, had just won a Promise Neighborhood grant. This was an implementation grant. It was a really large implementation grant for a specified geography in San Antonio, on the east side of San Antonio. And the grant was heavily focused in on education, mostly education for school-age children. There was ability to fund early learning, so children from birth through 5. And we had an entire initiative around that piece that aligned with our dual generation initiative. But the biggest gap that we found with Promise Neighborhood is how to prepare families to stay in neighborhoods that go through transformation. So we knew that with an investment, a large investment by the U.S. Government, by the U.S. Department of Education, specifically during the Obama administration, that the neighborhood could change, right, over a period of time. This was a neighborhood that had been disinvested in for 40 to 50 years. And now, all of a sudden, in 2012, there was a very large investment in the school system that was there, San Antonio ISD. And then we had the great fortune to have this all-stars align and trifecta, if you will, with the local housing authority, San Antonio Housing Authority, receiving a choice neighborhood for nearly the exact same footprint as the Promise neighborhood. So now you had 2 really large federal grants in a concentrated set of neighborhoods on the east side of San Antonio. Again, knowing that there was going to be transformation in the neighborhood, we wanted to make sure that families were prepared to stay in their homes if there were rising property taxes, and prepared for the changes that could possibly come in a neighborhood. And part of that was to stabilize families and then to have them thrive over time. And so we found that the investments by the Annie E. Casey Foundation in this 2-generation model would really serve and fill the gap around job training, job coaching, job placement, workforce development in the east side of San Antonio, as well as that early learning piece. Again, the Promise neighborhood for us was really that K through 12 pipeline, so that level of school age kids, but really missed the family that supports the school age kids, right? And the very youngest members in their families, their infants and toddlers. And so the Annie Casey Foundation came at a really wonderful moment for us to fill that gap around preparing families to get stabilized first, and then to thrive over a period of time with stable financial incomes through job coaching and placement.
Really appreciate that history, Henry. I want to just a follow-up question. Again, because I think many of the people listening today might be left with the impression of, like, you saw the strategic gap, there was a very well-defined program, you sort of like slot the program in. In reality, the 2-generation or the dual generation program model took several years to emerge and develop, right, as a concept and a clear thing. And I'm curious, as folks think about the concept of nesting, do you have any lessons learned about that your original conception and how you talked about that when you didn't have a clear program model to start with necessarily?
Yeah, that's a great question, I did make it sound like, you know, another rosy picture again here. At the end, that's how it all worked out. And in retrospect, right, we knew what the gap was. We knew that the community was going to change. But you're right to mention that in those early years, at least 2 to 3 years, that design model changed and altered and pivoted. Lakeisha was actually part of that work. She was first placed at an early development center and to see whether or not we could recruit families that way. And what does that mean, recruit? What are we recruiting them to, right? So there was lots of discussion about not doing to the neighborhood or to the community, but doing with. And how does that approach work? And so that was really critical for us. We had families that were part of our stakeholder group that informed the way that the design worked. But going back to the issue of nesting, I will say for those who are thinking about this level of investment and being able to think about a nesting approach, it did give us the ability to flex and to be flexible. And what I mean by that is that because we had a broader investor on around the K-12, that school pipeline, what we were able to do is have the flexibility to have these design years and test what worked and what didn't work. And then when we finally found our sweet spot, probably by year number 3, we were able to sort of jump up and stand everything up that we needed to. But it did give us the ability to continuously work with families because we were nested in that partnership, that set of partners around Promise Neighborhood and Choice Neighborhood, and then move from there. And so you maybe call it like a safety net for us, and safety net for families because they were continuously getting different services and participating and engaging in different ways.
Thanks, Henry. I really appreciate that clarification. I'm loving these questions that are coming in through the chat. Thank you all. Just a reminder, feel free to plop your questions or your comments in there. One question was just around defining nesting. Again, I think, Henry, you started to go down, and I'll just take a stab at that. Is within the model, the idea of nesting is that you would take a broader effort, like a community change initiative, just outside of FCCC, it might be something as broad as the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, or something as narrow as a community health plan that that hospitals are required to do under the ACA. It's taking these initiatives that have multiple components already, and rather than trying to recreate a broad infrastructure, taking a specific program component or gap that might be missing and fitting it in, slotting it in a way that amplifies the broader work as opposed to trying to exist in a siloed program way. So that's what we mean when we talk about nesting. Lakeisha, I want to come to you. I remember the first time that I met you was at your office at the Ella Austin Community Center. You were actually in a cubicle in the hallway, and you were co-located with some of the other the Promise Neighborhood offices at the time. I'm curious from your perspective, what the resulting impact of the nesting approach was as you experienced it.
I would say that the result created less of a disruption for families. There was thoughts, ideas, and partners that were put into place to fill the gaps with education, early childhood, economic and financial stability, like Henry touched on. We began to have several conversations around developing strategies to continue to eliminate as many barriers to families as possible. And I think the community took note to the initiative's efforts to increase the family stability in the neighborhood, and community trust and relationship was built. And I think anytime you have a initiative or you are trying to do any part of change in the community, everyone knows that community trust is extremely important especially when you're having conversations about change in a neighborhood, because most of the time when you talk about change, it's viewed negatively. So I think that was one. Was impactful. It was very impactful because it created a less of disruption for families that were already experiencing generational poverty.
That's a really great history, Lakeisha. You were on the front lines. You remained on the front lines for the majority of the effort. I'm curious what guidance you would give to others, maybe frontline staff who are asked to, like, they're thrown into this nested environment, right? Like it's this conceptual idea. Any lessons learned that you would say to people who are on the front lines about how to approach this nested concept in order to best take advantage of it?
I think really if I can take it a step back, I think what was helpful for me was I was from the east side of San Antonio. So I was a child in a neighborhood that was full of promise that nothing ever happened. So to be placed in a situation to where I was able to reflect and be able to assist with the change, I think that helped me personally when I'm able to speak with families and talk about the change. So when the advice that I would give is coaching is extremely important. So you have to make sure that you have effective coaches, you have the training for coaches, you have all that, because these are individuals that are on the front line. These are individuals that are working directly with these families to assist them. But I would say be patient, be empathetic, be responsive, and be responsible.
Those are all words, Lakeisha, that I would say describe you to a T. I think which made you really effective in that position. I think the data bore that out very clearly. Henry, I want to ask you sort of the same question. You were sitting at the role of the sort of the core person or the lead person for the site. What advice would you give to other people who are sort of thrown into or take on the role of a backbone organization if they are going to nest something within a broader community change initiative? What should they do to be most successful?
This is, I think, I don't think it's just one thing or a set of things. I think it's mostly a perspective. So one thing that I would like to say about the nesting is that you asked earlier in one of your questions, Jared, about what's great about a nesting design. And I would say, so this level of co-location that Lakeisha talked about, being in the same building, you mentioned it as well, Jared. But in addition to that, we have not just the partners that are implementing the two-generation approach, that design, but we also have the secondary level of partners that are part of the larger network of that's the nest, if you will, right? We're nesting in the larger nest. And so there was a lot of partners coming together in coordination with each other in order to transform the neighborhoods. And so what advice would I would give is mostly around perspective and openness. I think a lot of what we're talking about today involves coming to the table, not necessarily, we used to always say this, actually, don't come to your table with your logo and your ego. Come to the table open-minded and knowing that we're here contributing to a North Star. And if you could leave the logo and the ego at the door, in fact, we said that oftentimes, if you leave the ego and the logo at the door, then and come into the room knowing that we're working together in partnership and in contribution to aligning our work towards some North Star. And in our case, it was family stability, early childhood development, right? The North Star could be different things. But if you can leave those things at the door and come into the room knowing that you're a fellow person working in this neighborhood, sometimes as a guest, sometimes like Lakeisha from the neighborhood, that we're doing the work in contribution toward that North Star. So I think it's a perspective, especially when you think about this nested approach, because we were small design in this larger promise neighborhood, monster of a design. And so there's some greatness with that, because we had the ability to have that flexibility, the ability to fail forward when things didn't work in our design, and still have the support that families needed. That was a huge privilege. But again, as we began to grow the design and then become a really major component of the whole nest, the idea here is not one thing is better than the other, right? Not the level of competition could be needed to be dissipated. So I think it's a perspective, right? You come in, you may represent an organization with your own mission, so you certainly have to keep that on your sleeve and in your heart. But knowing when you're coming into these larger types of community change efforts that you're bringing yourself, your talents and your organization's talents, but you're sort of leaving that ego behind because you have to work together in a collaborative.
Can I add something to that, Jared?
Please.
Something I think that is very important that I would advise everyone that even considers this is to involve the community that you are trying to work with. Let them know that you're there to help, and let them see that you're there to help. Get some volunteers from the community to help. Listen to their ideas, listen to their suggestions, because I think the scary part is these neighborhoods feel like organizations are coming in to take over and not to help them. So my advice is to involve the community, involve the parents, start a parent committee, get these parents involved in. For us here locally in San Antonio, we're going to start having parents present at our partner tables. We're going to have our parents plan their own family engagement events. So it's getting the community involved in your process.
I love that, Lakeisha, and I was just getting ready to move us on to the next section, but I'm going to pause for just a second because what you just shared aligns with, I think, a question that came in through the chat, which is how involved are the actual families or participants in the effort? And I think that you talk about them coming, now to sit at the partner table. There's been a long road in that within FCCC. Parents were invited to some of the national convenings at some point, but there was also some feedback that it didn't happen as substantively or as quickly as it needed to. I wonder, Lakeisha, since you were just talking about this, maybe I can give you first stab at answering that question about how families were involved, and then Henry, I'll look to you to add anything on top of that in regard to that question.
I think we talked about bringing families. We did have a level of participation from families at some point of planning their own family engagement events, but I think we felt like parents needed to be more involved. This is their community. We're walking alongside of them. We're meeting them where they are. We're not trying to decide their family stability for them. We're trying to navigate and help them. Yes, we did have parents that joined us at the FCCC convenings. We had monthly family engagement events where we brought all families together to celebrate them. We made sure we were present at graduations. We made ourselves available. I can't stress that enough. We made ourselves available, and you're talking about neighborhoods where individuals struggled with lack of motivation, lack of low self-esteem. So having that connection with them and developing that trust and building those relationships was extremely helpful. So families were involved with the effort. We would have liked for them to be more involved and be at the partner table sooner than they are, but it's coming and it's happening.
Henry, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I'm looking at the question in the chat as well, and I think start early, right? So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the Promise Neighborhood had an advisory council that managed a portion of the Promise Neighborhood funds, and this grant was $23.7 million. So a portion of those funds were unaccounted for that the Department of Ed allowed for the community to design. And so the advisory council was made up of every teacher, principal, and a teacher from each of the campuses, because this was an education focused grant, but also community members and advocates from the community. And we relied heavily for about, I think it was 6 years on that advisory committee to also provide insight to FCCC. But I want to make a clear point that what Lakeisha is saying, that there was lots of engagement and involvement, but you're absolutely right, Jared, in the sense that we needed to be able to share power in different ways with community. And one way is to have families or individuals that were actually receiving the benefits sitting at the table helping make decisions. And that was very difficult for a few years and many years to actually get families there for multiple reasons, right? Oftentimes we asked them to be at work or in a training during the same times that these meetings were happening. So changes needed to be made in order for that accommodation to occur, or for that to actually be realized. So those are just a few points I wanted to make.
Love those, Henry. And I will just add, from the overall evaluation perspective, one of the things that we realized not till quite late in the game is that who was a co-investor in the strategic co-investor had not been a super well-defined parameter, and that there was perhaps an over-reliance on a definition of a funder as a co-investor. And I think one of the places where we land in our final report is the value of expanding the definition of co-investor to include partners on the ground who are implementing, as well as those community members and those who are receiving services, who bring so much to the process and the game. Lakeisha, Henry, thank you so much for going down that. I want to end this section as I transition us over by just reiterating, put it on a bumper sticker, leave your ego and logo at the door. I think just sort of a critical statement in terms of thinking about this nesting approach and making it work effectively. So our last section is on the evaluation. You've already alluded to this, that this was a tension in a strategic co-investor approach. It was a tension from a workload perspective. It was a tension from a who got to decide. It was a tension from what are we actually what's the right data point to get to? Henry, I want to sort of ask you, was there anything unique in to using a strategic co-investor approach that made evaluation different from evaluation and in other grant making efforts that you've been a part of?
Jared, the very short, brief answer is all of it was different. All of it was unique. And one of the reasons why is because when you receive a grant, there's usually a third-party evaluator or a requirement around some type of local evaluator. If you have the great fortune of receiving some grant that doesn't require that, then great, right? You move on, you take the funding, you count your blessings, and then you move on and implement the work. But most times there's some level of evaluation, and oftentimes, more often than not, you have individuals that are coming in to observe, to survey, to take, and then go and do something with it, and you never see the product. It goes somewhere to the funder, and sometimes those things get published, sometimes they get put in a newsletter, but oftentimes sites don't actually even see what transpired from the giving that we've given. And that was very different than what we experienced with the foundation. Not immediately. I will say that I don't know how the Annie E. Casey Foundation actually got this passed through the board of through the board or anyone else, but initially in years 1 through 3, there was a sense that there was going to be a third-party evaluator. Urban Institute came on board. Jared, you and your firm came on board for this. And I think you might have gotten, this is a big assumption, but I think you might have gotten those contracts signed and the directives and you moved on. And then I remember having a conversation with the Casey Foundation saying, wait a minute, why didn't anybody tell us that, number one, who these people are that want to come see us? And then secondarily, what are we measuring? I was never told, our community partners weren't told what we're going to exactly be evaluating, and why don't we have a say in that? I would say though, Jared, normally I probably wouldn't have asked that if I was dealing with a traditional funder, but because the idea that this was a co-investor approach, we assumed, and I'll just own it, I assumed that meant in all aspects, inclusive of evaluating this initiative, that it would be a co-partnership, right? Co-investor to me equaled co-partnership. And so I asked, wait, do we have any say in what's being measured? Do we have any say in how it gets implemented? Some sites had expertise in this, so why wouldn't we, when we think about that sharing of power, why wouldn't we share the power and bring the expertise in? I also mentioned once or twice, teach us how to do it so that when you're gone from the site, that our site knows how to evaluate ourselves and have rapid cycle learning and continuous learning. So there was a request, at least I can speak from my perspective, there was a request to have contribution in how this was designed before it was implemented onto us. And I will say the Casey Foundation was incredible with that response. Never was my hand ever slapped. Never did we feel any repercussions because we lifted that up as a community. Instead, the doors were opened and negotiation started with each side about how to do this and how to move this forward. Still, it was a lot of work. So I don't want to minimize the tension that Lakeisha felt and frontline workers felt to collect the information, but at least the doors were open.
Yeah. Thanks, Henry. We'll come back and revisit that in just a second, but before we do that, Lakeisha, I want to, I remember our first interview with in this little tiny cubby hole, and I remember the look on your face when I asked you something along the lines of, so how effective is Casey being in this partnership? Are they showing up okay? And you're like, are you really asking me about to assess the Casey Foundation? I wonder from your perspective, was there anything unique about, what did it mean to you as a community partner to sort of be asked to evaluate Casey?
I would say that it was very different because being a partner, you're so used to funders funding programs, and then you're completing an evaluation and then an audit on yourself and your program, and then they're pretty much very hands-off. If I would be completely honest, I would say that at one point, the evaluations were a bit too, they were a bit too much, it was too many. But when you came and you first visited me, and I thought that the evaluation was going to be based on, our initiative and our program. So when you had that conversation, you opened it up and he was like, no, I'm here to evaluate Casey, the Casey Foundation. I'm like, really? Is that, I think you probably saw the shocked look on my face, because I'm like, this normally does not happen. You normally do not have a funder that sends in the evaluator to evaluate how they're doing their process and how they're working. So I think it was different, and I was shocked. But at the end, I will say that I really appreciated it, because not only were they saying we're going to send evaluators to evaluate your initiative, but we want to know how we're doing. So I think that just showed a level of, it was respect from us to them as well, and vice versa. It just showed that mutual respect.
Thanks, Lakeisha. Henry, Lakeisha, both of you sort of allude to this fact of a lot of data being collected. Sometimes, like, is it the right data? One of the questions that we got in the chat was, did the data that was gathered reflect the objectives it was intended to measure? I'm curious if either of you have a reflection on that.
Well,
I would say, oh,
yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Lakeisha, please.
you can start us off. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna respond and say we helped design it that way. And so, because initially, and I honestly, this was a good 8 years ago. So initially, I remember seeing a PowerPoint that came through that said, "Here's what we're going to evaluate. Here's the data we need you all to collect." And that's when we said, "Wait a minute, we need to be part of that design." So we made the design. And I'm not so sure, this is where you have expertise, right? Experts who know how to do evaluation like this to say, is it too much on a site or is it too little on a site? But because we helped with the design, I think just from my perspective, I'm not so sure we were quite prepared for how much tax it was going to be on our frontline partners, and the parents themselves, because we did ask for parents to pretty consistently be part of these conversations around evaluation. But I would say that, it was part of what we placed in the co-design of this. So part of it was our fault as well, I guess.
Yeah. Lakeisha?
Well, thank you for adding that, Henry. I'm glad I know that now. No.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think that, again, as I stated in the beginning, it did begin to be a bit much as far as all these evaluations and all the reportings. We had, the METIS reports, we had Urban Institute site visits, we had TCC group, Jared, we had data walks, we had focus groups, and I just remember expressing those concerns to Henry and was like, we're working directly with these families that already require a lot of dependability, time, and resources from me, and the families need me to be available. So I felt that if we were doing so much reporting and participating in all these evaluations, then that would continue to pull me away from my focus on the families and or families that I can potentially, be working with. So I would say in the beginning, it was a strain, but then toward the end and at the end, I think it all paid off. And I think when we get to wrapping up, I can talk a little bit about how it paid off in the end for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think from a strategic co-investor approach, it's important to note that if you're going to do this in collaboration, like, that's an additional cost on top of the actual data gathering and whatnot. So all those meetings and figuring out the joint metrics, that's a lot of work, right? And we heard that there's a lot of effort and energy that goes into that we sometimes forget about as part of this overall process. At this point, I want to just sort of begin to wrap us up, and we've covered a lot of questions that were in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to Kintayani Murray, back to Kintayani, to just see, Kintayani, any questions that we missed as we were going through that you want to lift up for the panel?
Sure. Well, on the question of power, there was one that came up around what power did KC not give up? And I was wondering, Jared, I know you've been moderating. I thought maybe you might want to lead off with some insights from the evaluation.
Yeah, so I would echo one thing that I think Henry mentioned, which is that in the evaluation, initially the foundation didn't seem to want to give up. They were doing it collaboratively, so I don't want to give an impression that they weren't doing it collaboratively, but it felt much more foundation directed than collaborative or community initiated or community directed. So that was one area that I think was a real tension point. A second area that I would highlight is actually an area where the foundation, I think we found, didn't take enough power, which was around the technical assistance. And I think that there was sort of this notion of being highly responsive, and the sites repeatedly, particularly in the earlier years, were like, well, tell us what you know. What are you seeing? What do you think the opportunities should be? And so we think that there, and in the report, we'll talk about how do you find that balance between those two. But I think it was an area where in some ways the foundation gave up too much of its role in order to achieve maximum effectiveness. So I would just highlight those two things.
Thank you. And Henry or Lakeisha, any other comments you want to make to kind of wrap up the power dynamic related questions? Any other thoughts before we go to the next question?
Katini, just to reiterate what Jared just said, I think that it was a funny story that we used to like to say with regards to Casey and the technical assistance and in year number 1, and then it carried into year number 2, and that is Casey said, just let us know what you need around technical assistance. We're happy to provide it. And we didn't know what we didn't know. So we pretty consistently said, well, what do you have? What can you bring? Do you have a menu? And it was a cyclic conversation because they said, well, we have what you might need, but you need to tell us what you need. And we pretty consistently said, but what do you have? We don't know what we need. And so it was this interesting conversation, very much in year number 1, but carried into year number 2 with regards to the comment that Jared just mentioned about the TA.
And from a partner standpoint, when it came to the need of technical assistance, we just approached Henry and said, Henry, we want some coaching. We want some TA on messaging. And so she handled everything on the back end, so we didn't have to experience that. We went to our fearless leader and she made it happen. So sorry, Henry.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, probably with some brief responses. What happens when leaders or key point persons leave during the process? And this was a 7-year initiative, so certainly there was some turnover within the partnership as well as at Casey. So any thoughts about how this kind of impacted the strategic co-investor approach? Henry, would you like to start us off?
Sure. And I'll try to be brief here. I know we're closing up here. I would say at the strategic co-investor role, there was a little bit of learning curve, but we initiated the person who came in after Amaretta Morris. This was Jaron Price. And he also brought in another individual, Burgundy, who was they were wonderful. And then when Jaron left, we had Tracy, and also initiated Tracy into our work and said, this is how we work with the Casey Foundation. We hope that you guys can do the same. And so I would say that the turnover at the Casey Foundation, albeit it felt personal because we had built a relationship with each person. So after each person left, they took a little piece of our hearts, but we were able to indoctrinate them and acculturate them to our work here in site. We amazingly did have turnover in our local site. But I stayed for in the entire length practically of our relationship with the Casey Foundation. Lakeisha, as you heard, also. But for those sites that didn't have that, I think the institutionalization, and we go back to the nesting conversation, both of those are really helpful to have when your partnership and your partners know what they're contributing to and what their role is. Then turnover can still be maintained in the sense of maintaining their contribution to the North Star. And then if you have those MOUs in place or the institutional pieces in place locally, that nesting is really helpful in that sense, because you have a safety net of partners to rely back on to communicate the relationship and how you move things forward. So that's what I would say about those.
And I just want to add one quick tidbit to that. And also, like here locally, what we used to do is we used to have a dual generation one-on-one, like an onboarding process. Anytime new partners came on, we did a whole seminar where we onboarded them into the initiative. So I just wanted to add that.
Excellent. Thank you for raising that point. That is wonderful guidance for other partnerships and organizations embarking on this work. I want to thank you all panel for your awesome insights and inspiration for the strategic co-investor approach work. And thank you all who've joined us. We appreciate your attention and participation. Casey's used this information to inform our future efforts. We've shared the insights with the field, as Jared mentioned, and you can learn more by going to the Casey website via this link. And I believe that it's being placed in the chat. The infographic and blog of the strategic co-investor findings are available. And again, we will make these slides available if you need to pick up those links. We'll have a report of the strategic co-investor findings in full that will be available. We're aiming for late April, and you can find that report on the Casey and the TCC websites. So thank you so much for joining us today. The Annie E. Casey Foundation really appreciates your interest in this topic. And thank you again, panelists.